All right, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Come Cloud with Us. And today we're talking about Kubernetes. So, Come Cloud with Kubernetes. Um, my name is Abdul Kazi, and I have my co host, Chris. Hey, Chris, how's it going?
Hey, everybody. Welcome. Great. Good. How about you?
Good.
Got a
Honestly,
few folks here
doesn't
today, so
feel
this is wonderful. I love it.
it's a full house. I love it. And this is one of the reasons I love virtual events because we have people across the globe, different time zones. So you can never get this through physical event. You can, but it's challenging, right? Especially on a meetup. So absolutely thrilled to have everybody here today. Really, really honored to be hosting along with Chris, and we have a lot of big names here. So, with that being said, we'll let the panelists introduce themselves, starting with Christina.
Right, yeah, thank you, and thanks for giving me an opportunity to join this event today. So, my name is Kristina Devochko. I am based in Oslo, Norway, so I may look a bit sleepy. I hope I'm not because it's over 11 p.m. here. And I'm working as a software architect and have been working with Kubernetes for more than 3 years now. Yeah, I on my spare time I do love playing CTF, capture the flag, for those who know what that is, because I find it really, really fun to sit in until the middle of the night to try to figure out what the flag is. But that's not what I'm gonna do today. So today I'm gonna talk with you about Kubernetes, and I'm really excited for all the discussions we're gonna have.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. And just to add, she was awarded the Microsoft MVP for Azure in September. So
Yes,
that's
thank
pretty
you,
impressive.
because
Yeah.
I was not able to remember that right now. Thanks for mentioning that, yes.
No, absolutely. So now moving along to Caslin.
Hello. I'm Caslin Fields, and I'm a developer advocate at Google Cloud, where I focus on Google Kubernetes Engine and open source Kubernetes. So I do a lot of stuff with the community, go to a lot of events, and teach people about Kubernetes, which I hope to do more of here.
Yeah, absolutely. And talk to us about you're a Cloud Native Computing Foundation ambassador. So what
Yeah.
does that look like? And for the folks who don't know what that means.
There's a couple folks on here who are part of the first round of ambassadors. The CNCF actually is revamping their ambassador program. So there's a bunch of information out there now. If you are very involved with the Cloud Native community, if you run a meetup or, I don't know, do all sorts of things to help lead and gather Cloud Native communities wherever you are, the CNCF has this program to kind of help those leaders and make sure that they have a connection to the foundation so that they can help support the community. So definitely read more about that program. The applications are open now until the February 20 something, close to the end of the month. I think it might be 25th. But definitely check that out.
Yeah, I'll post the link here in the chat so people can take a look. Perfect. Thanks so much. Next up is Kat.
Hello, folks. My name is Kat Cosgrove. I'm a lead developer advocate at Dell. And you may be asking yourself, what on earth does Dell have any business having developer advocates for? The answer is that they're paying me to teach people about DevOps, which is pretty rad. So I don't. I'll teach about infrastructure as code. I'll teach you about Kubernetes. I'll teach you about CI/CD. That's usually where I stay pretty focused. I'm currently based out of Seattle, but soon to be based out of Edinburgh, Scotland, which I think that is the first time I've said that publicly. But yeah, moving to Scotland. We're supposed to provide like an interesting or surprising fact about ourselves too. An interesting or surprising fact about me is that I was a photographer for the Tokyo 2020 Olympics. Yes, the ones that occurred during the pandemic with no attendees.
Interesting. Interesting. Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing.
It was weird.
I can imagine that. And I understand that you have served on the Kubernetes release team since version 1.22. So talk to us about that experience.
The release team is fun. It is difficult, but it is fun. We're made up of multiple teams with specific responsibilities. Most of them are some flavor of project management, but each sub-team handles something very specific that is the release could not go forward without. So there is a team that handles all of the comms for the release, which is things like publishing and writing the release blog, dealing with PR requests for the release lead, making sure that feature blogs get written and published on time. There's also a separate team for docs and tracking all of the enhancements and CI signal and bug triage and on and on and on. There are a bunch of different sub teams that all handle very important parts of the release process. And I am honored to be a part of it. It's a lot of work, but it is very rewarding to be a part of the process that actually gets a new version of Kubernetes out the door.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you so much. So next up is Nils.
Hey everybody, this is Niels. I am a digital and app innovation specialist at Microsoft. Basically what that means is that I work with some of our strategic customers around their adoption of modern app dev services. 80% of my time is spent with Kubernetes, and in particular the Azure Kubernetes service, on which I wrote a book a couple of years ago where Richard, who's on this as well, was actually one of my tech reviewers. And in terms of a fun fact, I'm actually in the middle of a training cycle for an ultra marathon that I'll do on March 25th, where I'm hoping to run 50K in Southern California.
Wow, 50K, that's amazing. Yeah, I cannot even do a half marathon, so kudos to you for 50K.
Well, I'll tell you this, like ultra running is often equated with trail running, and so there's a lot of elevation, and you're allowed to, we call it power hike the incline.
Wow, awesome.
That sounds intense.
Yeah, sure does. Sure does. Okay, thanks, Nell. And by the way, I did put a link to your books in the chat, so if anybody's interested. Okay, so next up is Richard.
Yeah, so I'm Richard, also known as Pixel Robots Online. I'm an Azure architect for a company called Intercept, who are based in the Netherlands. But as you could probably tell, I'm from the UK. I'm actually living up in Newcastle in the Northeast, and my day-to-day is literally AKS, Azure Kubernetes Service. I live and breathe inside it every day for my customers. And
Nice.
I guess the fun fact is I really, really like Disney. I like to go to the parks a lot and spend a lot of time there. So, yeah. You're always catching me singing Frozen and stuff like that. So
Awesome. And I know you have a book coming out soon.
yeah, March the 3rd. It's called Azure Containers Explained. It sort of teaches you or tries to help you know when to use which Azure technology to run your container workloads. You know, AKS isn't always the answer. There are other places you can run it. So we try and use scenario bases to sort of know when to use which one and when to move to the next one.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Richard. Next up is Steve.
Hey everyone. So Steve Buchanan. I'm based in Minneapolis, and it is warming up. It's like in the high 30s, so it's like spring to us right now. I know that might sound crazy.
Trust me, I know, because in Toronto, same here, right? So we're supposed to be in the negatives this time around.
Shorts and t-shirts right now. It's crazy, but so I'm a principal program manager with Microsoft. I'm focused on improving Azure, and I focus specifically on AKS and all things containers. And I also work across clouds, so I'm a multi-cloud guy. Author, so I've authored 8 books. My last 2 books involved Kubernetes. So one of them was Intro to AKS, and the last one was Azure Arc Enable Kubernetes and servers. Do a ton of stuff on Pluralsight as well. So I have courses out there on Kubernetes and a bunch of other topics. Fun fact, let's see. So I actually did Wushu Kung Fu with 2 of my sons. And this was a while ago, but we reached black belt, so it's the only thing I can think of right now.
So that's impressive. And the other
Yeah.
impressive thing is I didn't realize is you were 10 years MVP. So that's pretty impressive too.
Yes, former. So as soon as I
Former,
joined
yeah.
Microsoft, you lose the lose the
True.
status. But
Fair point. But yeah, absolutely. That's great. And last but not least, Glenn.
How you guys doing? Glenn Belton, Kubernetes platform engineer at United Wholesale Mortgage. Been working with Kubernetes for about a little over 2 years now. Pretty much what I do on a daily basis. I actually built a PowerShell module that can actually manage all of your Kubernetes clusters and deploy your workloads to clusters and like monitoring and reporting capabilities that I'm hoping to publish soon. Fun fact about me, this may or not be a fun fact, but I'm going to try this. So this arm right here used to be double jointed and I can like twist it all which way. So I'm going to try this. So this may or may not be true. All right.
No,
haven't
that's
done it in a
definitely a
while.
fun fact. I'm excited.
Okay, there we go. Wait. I can like twist it all the way back.
it's blanking out, so we
Yeah,
can
let me
only
see.
partially see it.
There we go.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
I was close. Okay. That's still a fun fact. I can use that one again. Cool.
That's awesome. That's good. Okay, so before we jump into the actual discussion about what Kubernetes is and whatnot, let's talk about conferences. I know a couple of folks here have been to conferences, so I'll pick on Caslin because I know she's been to a lot of conferences lately. So let's hear.
I do a lot of conferences. Even now, things really started to come back in the last year. So I feel like I did a lot of in-person events, at least for me, last year.
Yeah, they sure did.
And so my most recent two were KubeCon North America in Detroit, which was in October of last year. And actually earlier this year, just a couple of weeks ago, I went to the Cloud Native Security Con that was held in Seattle. So that was like, that one's interesting. A bunch of folks at the event were trying to figure out what was going on with it. But it used to be a co-located event at KubeCon, and it got so big that they decided to spin it out into its own event. So it was like the first time it had been its own event, but had previously been part of KubeCon.
Nice. Anybody else? Feel free to jump in.
Yeah.
I also go to conferences a lot, just like as a function of my job. I think last year I had 2 runs where I was straight up back-to-back conferences, not at home at all for 3 solid weeks, which I would not recommend anybody do. But as for conferences that are coming up this year that are not KubeCon, but will still have some Kubernetes DevOps-ish content, any given DevOps days probably has at least 1 or 2 Kubernetes related things on the schedule. And I cannot recommend community events highly enough. DevOps Days events are community events. So there's always some talks that are like put together on a schedule through an open CFP. But then there's also a sort of like unconference type thing that they call open spaces, where you, the attendees, determine what the topics are. It's very fun, it's very informative, and it's a good way to learn from and be a part of your local tech community. So I super recommend going to a DevOps Days.
And I'm an organizer of DevOps Days Seattle.
Oh,
And I want to second the DevOps Days. Awesome conferences, local, very welcoming, and a special shout out to DevOps Days Minneapolis.
oh yeah, DevOps Days Minneapolis slaps. Chicago also slaps. Seattle is my home DevOps Days, so I agree that it also rules. They have the best speaker gifts as well. Castle.
Awesome. Anything? I know, Christina. There's supposed to be something coming up in Oslo or Europe.
Oh yeah, Yeah, I think I am pretty new as a speaker at the conference level, I can say. But I have been doing a lot of work on kind of boosting up the cloud native community in Oslo and in Norway in general. So we have a quite engaging community on Cloud Native and Kubernetes Oslo, which is an umbrella under the CNCF umbrella in Norway. So we have like 100 plus participants on the meetups. So we see that people are eager to get that knowledge and to have a chat with like-minded people. But for me, I'm actually gonna be speaking at KCD Amsterdam at Kubernetes Community Days Amsterdam next week, and at KCD Ukraine, which are like free community events that anyone can join. No, not all of them are free. Sorry, I need to be precise there. And I guess the highlight for me will be speaking at KubeCon this year for the first time. Super excited about it and scared at the same time. I've been looking at KubeCon as like this huge, impressive conference with so many great names and professionals. So this will be interesting to see it from the other side.
That makes sense. Any of you guys, Richard, Glenn, or Nils?
I'm really looking forward to KubeCon this year. I was going to go to the MVP summit, hopefully, but I've been that off in favor of KubeCon because I think it's going to be more beneficial. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. Hopefully get to meet a lot of you guys and girls over there, which will be awesome.
Nice.
I actually attended KubeCon as well back in October. I'm actually from Detroit, so I was excited when I found out that KubeCon would be in Detroit. And I actually won an electric scooter at KubeCon. It's a very, very dope electric scooter. So I won it from one of the vendors there. Yeah. I won a scooter. I took it to the office the next day, and I was like flying around the office in that thing.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I think we lost Kat, but hopefully she'll join back.
Yeah, let's hope so. I was at that same KubeCon in Detroit, and that was the third conference for me in 2022. And all three of those conferences were in subsequent weeks. So I was a speaker at at the Little Rock Tech Fest on one Friday. The next week I spoke at the Denver Dev Days, and the week after I was an attendee at KubeCon. So at least at KubeCon I wasn't talking, but it was fun to meet Richard face to face because we'd been working together. And KubeCon is just an amazing event. The session content is really good, but just the vibe and walking around the hallways and being able to talk to anybody in the community is just so great because the community is welcoming. Just look at everybody on this call. We have people from all different companies. We've got Microsoft and Google on the same call, and I think that wasn't possible pre-Kubernetes.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's a good question. So with that being said, let's get into our segue of what Kubernetes is, right? Like in the past, I guess, year or so, Kubernetes has really become a buzzword. Think about the cloud like a couple of years ago. So and what's the hype? So let's talk about what does Kubernetes mean, what it is it really a hype? And then we'll talk about some use cases.
If I can jump in, I didn't do a fun fact earlier, but my fun fact would be that I like to do illustrations for my my tech content. So I have this analogy where I talk about Kubernetes and containers using a cookie analogy. So the way that I like to describe Kubernetes to people is that it is about logistics of running applications at scale. It's a tool that allows you to take a whole bunch of computers and run your applications across them using a single centralized system with a lot of really nice management tools for running things at scale.
Yeah.
I'm going to be stealing that. Sorry. I like that a lot.
Please do. And the cookie analogy, by the way, is that containers are like cookies because really what you care about is running your applications. So that's like the chocolate chips in a cookie because that's the best part. And then the rest is all of your dependencies that you mix up and you bake into a convenient portable package. And the analogy extends to Kubernetes I usually talk about like a cookie company, not because it's what makes the cookies. You can make them elsewhere, but it's more of a logistics company that manages a global cookie business. That's kind of what Kubernetes does for your applications.
Well, if we're going down the analogy route, the analogy I like to use for Kubernetes is that of an orchestra, where each individual instrument is like a container or part of your application, and Kubernetes is the director or the orchestrator that's standing in front and that's directing everybody to play in a harmony. Now, if you make that more technical, if we think about Kubernetes, it's a container orchestration platform where you have container-based applications, typically in the form of a Docker container, that you need to host at scale, as Keslin said, across many multiple computers, many multiple servers. And Kubernetes has very advanced capabilities to make that happen reliably at scale.
I got a
That's
funny
great.
analogy for Kubernetes. So my analogy is Kubernetes is like the Matrix Part 2, where Agent Smith was able to like create many copies of himself in like seconds. Kubernetes allows you to scale your application in seconds to however many copies you want. So yeah, that's my my fun analogy for Kubernetes compared to Agent Smith in the Matrix movie.
While we
So-
are on an analogy path, all of you here, I actually thought making it a bit interesting since everyone is talking about ChatGPT. So before this meeting, as I said, I love cats. So I asked ChatGPT to help me out to create an analogy about what Kubernetes is in context of cats. And I really liked that. And my husband did like that as well. So I thought, why not share it in this session as well? Maybe it will help to make it a bit easier to process. So if you think about a house that is full of cats that you want to keep organized and well behaved, and you would also like to add more cats and remove the cats that may not be behaving that good and rearrange the cats without causing chaos in the house, that's where Kubernetes may come in. So it can be as a cat sitter that helps you organize and manage your cats, which if you put it in parallel are applications and services that you would like to manage, so that you can keep your house or your infrastructure running smoothly. So you can put your cats in baskets or in containers and have Kubernetes manage it for you, so that you will have a house that will be full of happy, well-behaved cats, or you will be able to run a big, complex a set of applications of different types in a scalable and flexible, expandable way. So maybe this can also be an analogy that can be used when you are finding it hard to read the official explanation at the Kubernetes talks of what it is.
It does kind of ruin the pets versus cattle analogy for those of you that are familiar with that.
Yeah, that to be honest, I don't like the cattle analogy, especially if you like if you like animals. So that has always been a bit of a strange definition for me to understand, because they mean like the cattle is replaceable. But that is definitely a good point, because many some Kubernetes distributions, for example, like Rancher, do use cattle as a very, very important definition of it. So that's a very good point you bring up, Nils.
And one thing I want to point out that I think folks have heard in a lot of these answers is scale. One of the biggest challenges that folks encounter when they're trying to learn Kubernetes is that it's pretty hard to learn on your own. You think, oh, I'll just spin up some kind of small project to help me with something around the house or something like that. But the whole point of Kubernetes is that it's really good at running things at very, very large scale. So it's really hard to get a good use case on an individual basis. So kind of speaking to the hype question, it's definitely a real hype thing, but often at a level that it's hard for individuals to grasp, because it's really meant for those large enterprise use cases.
Yeah, talking about use cases. So, what are typical use cases that you have seen in the field?
For me personally, in my job, I work with a lot of independent software companies or software as a service providers, and for them, Kubernetes is a great platform to be able to run their platforms at scale and also be able to scale together with their customer demand, be able to release new versions a little more seamless than they were able to previously. So I see a lot of software companies adopt it to deploy customer-facing software at scale. What I will say is the transition from more, let's say, legacy deployment models that are very machine focused to Kubernetes that is more like workload or container focused is a big transition for a lot of people because Kubernetes by its nature is very disruptive to your application is what I would say. It can very easily terminate parts of your application and move one container from one host to another. And that requires some maturity in your software development lifecycle to be able to deal with such interruptions in your application.
That makes sense. That makes sense. And then, Kat, I'll kind of pick on you because you're talking about Dell. So, how, from a Dell
Sure.
standpoint, how does that, what are the use cases there?
So Dell's work in Kubernetes is mostly around our CSI driver and CSM, which is a storage module for Kubernetes, because ultimately, like, Dell is a hardware company. We sell laptops and server racks and storage, right? So all of our like direct work with Kubernetes is around Kubernetes storage for the most part, or drivers for Kubernetes storage. But my work specifically with Kubernetes while at Dell doesn't actually have much to do with Dell's like business goals. They let me use and teach and talk about and work within Kubernetes however I personally see fit, because like ultimately what we want is to be an educational resource for people, whether or not it has anything to do with a Dell product. So a lot of what I do with Kubernetes is teaching it to very, very, very new students. Kubernetes can be very confusing to touch for the first time, whether you are like fresh out of school or you are a software engineer and have been for years, but have only ever really touched Docker. We saw that during the Docker shim deprecation, that a lot of the confusion actually came from engineers with years of experience who just like didn't understand the relationship Kubernetes had to containers. So a lot of what I do is teach people that. And I do that on Dell's time.
So that's a next good question. If people want to get into Kubernetes, how do they go about? Because to your point, right, it's so big. A lot of people come from
Yeah.
DevRel or other things. So kind of talk about that.
So a lot of people will try at first to like deploy their blog with Kubernetes, which is kind of like a long running joke with Kubernetes, powering your blog with it. And I think it's a useful way to understand the mechanics of Kubernetes, but not a good way to understand the usefulness of Kubernetes, because realistically, there is no universe in which your blog is ever going to be getting enough traffic to justify the scale at which Kubernetes really excels. No offense, but nobody has a blog that popular, right? It just is not reality. And also it's probably only running in one container. It's one service, right? Personally, my favorite resource for learning Kubernetes for like baby beginners is actually the GCP training on it. It is really well written. It is very interactive. It walks you through some like closer to real life scenarios, but a hurdle we're just kind of always going to have with teaching people Kubernetes is that some difficulties, some issues you run into, some configurations are things that you are only going to see the first time you try to operate it at scale. There is no like training people in advance for that. We can give them as much information as we can and equip them to ask the right questions and talk to the right people. But we can't actually make it. We can't simulate the experience of running like Spotify or Twitter, right? Like we can't simulate that scale.
No, that absolutely makes sense. And then Glenn, coming to you and Christina as well, you're using this in production. So talk to us about the tools you're using and how did you learn and what are the challenges?
I think the challenge is when you first set your eyes on Kubernetes and just start to try to understand what it is, and you read it and you read it, and you might take like a beginner's course, and you're just like, why am I working in IT? Like, I give up. I'm not smart enough. You beat your head against the desk. But eventually, if you keep going and keep going, you'll have those aha moments like every couple of months, to where it's like, okay, now this makes sense. So for me, I look at Kubernetes as an operating system for running containerized microservice applications. So if your company has, transitioned to the microservice architecture, there's benefit to running those in Kubernetes because, if you're running on traditional VMs and, there's a lot of traffic going to a service, what usually happens is your on-call engineer gets paged in the middle of the night, depending on how your applications function. But somebody will get paged and it's like, oh man, I got an alert. This VM is low on resources or whatever. But in Kubernetes, you're actually able to say, okay, if my application is taking X amount of traffic, just create another instance. Like the scaling capabilities is like the main benefit for me. But I look at it as an operating system. I kind of compare it to almost like as a server operating system, to where you need, as we move toward production, you need those production grade tools. You need to have some type of login installed, just like on the server. You need to have some type of monitoring agent installed, just like on the server. You need to have some type of security agent installed, just like on the server. Some of the tools that I would say that I use on a daily basis, I actually created my own PowerShell module that manages a Kubernetes cluster. So we're able to kind of spin clusters up. They go through like an onboarding process, and then that way we can deploy all of our tools. So my job is to basically provision a cluster, and more importantly, bootstrap that cluster for our DevOps team to actually deploy workloads that are created, like the actual microservice applications. But it's got to be production ready. You need, developers need access to their logs and metrics and things for the applications.
I want to touch on something Glenn said at the beginning of that, which is that, like Kubernetes it's really hard the first time you touch it. And it can make you feel like you don't know what you're doing. That's not you, like ever. As it's not your fault that Kubernetes is hard to learn. There is hope, and you will get there eventually. It's not just you feeling that way. Everybody feels that way, which is our fault, right? We're getting better at teaching people how to use Kubernetes. We're getting better at writing documentation for it that's a little bit more newbie friendly. But a thing that's like important to never forget is that there is no like one Kubernetes expert who knows absolutely everything there is to know about all of the tiny little moving pieces that make Kubernetes work. There are people that are experts in like a handful of these aspects of Kubernetes. And for everything else, they have other team members who are experts in those aspects of Kubernetes, or they know who to ask. We are a very friendly and helpful and welcoming community. So if you do get stuck, just come ask on Slack and we'll help you. But yeah, this is mostly we are just have not historically been very good at teaching it, and we're getting better at it.
Okay. No, that makes sense. And I guess maybe take a step back and say, we should ask, okay, do we need Kubernetes? Why, I guess, or somebody might be thinking, why do we need Kubernetes? So maybe Steve or Richard can answer that question for us.
Yeah, so I actually have a story that relates to that, and this will speak to the use case as well and like the hype about it. So prior to Microsoft, I was in the consulting space working with Fortune 500 companies. And we had a scenario where a client came to us and they had hundreds of websites all over the place with multiple hosting companies, shared hosting, dedicated hosting, like all over the place. And they came to us and they're like, we want to put all of this on Kubernetes and we want to put it all on AKS. And so the first thing we did was started looking at, well, what are these sites? They were all like PHP, they were various CMSs, and we ended up talking them out of going to AKS with that and actually going to Azure App Service with those sites. Most of those sites were able to run on Azure App Service, just like on it. Some of the sites had to be containerized, which is fine. We containerized those, and then we still ran them on Azure App Service. So some of them had like dependencies and stuff like Composer and other dependencies that weren't supported on Azure App Service. And that's where we had to step in and like containerize them. But this specific like organization and team, they were really like hyped up on Kubernetes as a buzzword, right? And not really taking a step back and really looking at like, do we really need all the overhead of AKS and, you know, managing Kubernetes and understanding it? And they had no training or anything like that. There was no need for like instant scale, right? So like Azure App Service could fit the need of the actual workloads. And so a lot of my time was spent in talking customers out of using Kubernetes and talking them into using using the right thing. Not like I didn't want customers using Kubernetes, but you want to get them on the right solution and not just use Kubernetes or something like AKS just because. Right. So little story there for that.
And
No,
I'll
makes sense.
echo what Steve is saying. I focus from within my job, as I said in my introduction, 80% of the time that I spend with customers is talking about Kubernetes, but Kubernetes sometimes feels like a shotgun approach to trying to swat a fly, if that's a good analogy. It is such a powerful mechanism, but with great power comes great responsibility. And as Glenn said earlier, you still need to think about monitoring and security and how you're going to do your upgrades, because don't forget there's a new version of Kubernetes every 3 months. And I feel like that it is a good fit for like large scale applications. Like there is a need that Kubernetes solves, but there also are a lot of applications that are being thought of in a Kubernetes world that might be a better fit for. Steve mentioned an app service on the Azure side, but on Google you have Cloud Run or Google App Engine. That might, for smaller type applications that can still scale, but that don't have all of the microservice complexity, where it probably is a better fit if you have a simpler or a less large scale application, if that makes sense.
And the best thing with that as well is you could start off there and then move as you start to grow your company, your app, and learn about Kubernetes. You can, end up at AKS or Kubernetes or another platform. If you make your choice once, you're not set in stone there. You can move it at any time. It's not like I've chose app services. I'm in app services for the rest of this application life now. So always keep that in mind.
Okay. And then I know Kubernetes is really a vanilla product, if you will, right? We talk about AKS, which is the Azure piece, and then Caslin, from your aspect, you kind of talk about the Google one, GCP one, and then AWS has it. So different flavors. Are there challenges with that, or what are learning curve? So if you learn Kubernetes, like how quickly is it, or is it easy to learn AKS or the EKS or ECS for the AWS ones?
So if I could jump in there, So I've never deployed a full Kubernetes cluster, like outright. I've never rolled my own Kubernetes cluster. And when I jumped into it, I jumped right into cloud-based Kubernetes. So I would recommend for someone learning to make sure you learn and understand the components, so you understand the control plane. You understand the the other plane, you understand the components, you understand things like namespaces and how everything works. But I don't see anything wrong, and maybe others disagree, but I don't see anything wrong with going out and spinning up a GKE, spinning up EKS or AKS, or diving into one of those, or even one of these like lab environments that are out there. So
yeah, the
There's-
only like issue I with those as a teaching tool is that like sometimes they cost money, right? Like you have to, even if you don't incur actual charges using one of these tools, you often still have to give them a credit card. So like in that situation, I use just Minikube. You know, Minikube is great for that. But like, if you don't mind giving GCP or AWS or whoever your credit card number, then no, I think it's perfectly fine to just use that. I just use that. I just use GKE. I don't touch anything else anymore. Really, it is easier. And I don't think that you materially lose a lot by only ever using a cloud version. Just because, yeah, like rolling your own cluster is harder and it is dangerous. It introduces like a ton of potential security concerns that you just simply do not have to think about when you're using a fully managed service from some cloud provider. It might be like a fun learning exercise to like roll your own, but I do not think it is at all necessary, because you're probably never going to do it professionally, honestly.
And to
And I wanna
piggyback off of
mention-
that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just want to mention that there is a certification that the managed services have that says we are using upstream Kubernetes. It's standard. Everything that you know from any version of Kubernetes should apply. Glenn,
Yep.
please tell us what you were going to say.
I was going to say, to piggyback off of Stephen Cat, in my opinion, if you're running production grade clusters, just use a managed service. Just because that, you know, there are some tools that are popping up now that can create clusters like Cluster API and Crossplane, but they're not super mature yet. So, I mean, managed services are the way to go if you're starting in production, if your company needs to run production Kubernetes, just because the fact that, you know, if you need a new node, it's one command line. You got a new node. You have all type of benefits. You don't have to worry about installing your core DNS. You don't have to worry about installing any of the components that you have to install when you build your own clusters. And don't forget that Kubernetes is still new. 2015 when it went GA, and then we had the pandemic and kind of lost 2 years. I don't think there was a company that was starting Kubernetes during the pandemic. Maybe if you were already into Kubernetes, you kept going, but you know, we lost 2 years from 2015. We're only in the beginning of 2023. So a lot of the tools will mature. Like I said, like Cluster API and Crossplane. But yeah, managed services I love them. It allows you to spin up a cluster with one click. You tell it what the node size you want, number of nodes, and boom, it's there. So that's just my opinion on that, for sure.
Yeah, and one more thing for anyone that's looking to learn, you can go out and sign up for a trial of A Cloud Guru. And once you're in there, I don't know how long the trial lasts or how many times you can sign up for it, but once you're in there, you can launch something called a playground, and they allow you to launch basically a playground in any of the three major clouds, so GCP, Azure, and AWS. And so you could go in there and start playing around with managed Kubernetes services.
I would say also as a learning tool, Code Cloud, they have some Udemy courses and they actually have their own website. And if you go on LinkedIn, almost everybody that's Kubernetes certified sends their thank you to Code Cloud for their courses and their I got certified LinkedIn posts. Mumshot has like the best Kubernetes courses in my opinion. So if you just want to learn Kubernetes, those courses are pretty dope. I use those to get my Kubernetes certifications. And they have like actual lab environments. You don't have to worry about spinning up any type of environment. They have their own lab simulator where you just go in, they give you the task to accomplish. But yeah, he was actually featured at KubeCon too. It's a really good learning place to learn Kubernetes.
Nice.
Nice. Anything from Christina or Richard?
I can also recommend Nigel Poulton's books because I find him to explain the things in a really, really simple and straightforward way. I remember I was reading some of his books, especially the Kubernetes book. I find it really good to learn about Kubernetes and to kind of clarify all these terms that may be really overwhelming for beginners. And regarding the sandbox environments and playgrounds, I also have quite a positive experience with Killer Coda. You get quite many scenarios where you also can focus on a specific thing, like, for example, a service mesh like Istio. You could get a sandbox spinned up there so you could play around with it, and you get a lot of that for free. And then to add some additional capabilities, you could pay like $5 a month or something. But have used it a lot in the beginning when learning more about Kubernetes. And from what I have experienced in my company, we had a challenge with when we had to kind of learn our operations staff who has been working a lot with Windows mainly for many years, and then we introduce even a managed Kubernetes service like Azure Kubernetes Service. It still requires you to understand the basics of Linux, the basics of networking, and the raw differences when you have been working with Windows for a very, very long time. And what I have seen has been really beneficial. One thing is to come up with a bunch of resources, like here are like 100 links, go there, learn it. But we set up workshops. We took concrete use cases, starting from very simple applications, starting from building those containers, starting from building Helm charts, taking very simple ones, taking some simple third-party ones, and doing it together. So everyone got their own namespace, we had a playground AKS cluster, and they started doing it together with us during the same session. And this has proven to be extremely beneficial. We got a lot of positive feedback. So this is something I could also recommend when you want to avoid a single point of failure where you are like the only Kubernetes expert or AKS expert everyone is running to. You do need to ensure that you have more resources that can step up, because if things go wrong, and things will go wrong, even if it's a managed Kubernetes service, it may go wrong. You need to be prepared for that. And if you are not there, for example, others will need to step up. And they need to understand where and how do they can get a bunch of data out, but what does this data actually mean? They need to understand the basics, at least, to be able to figure out where to investigate further. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share about it.
Yeah, I would agree with Nigel Poulton's book. It's such a good place to start learning Kubernetes. And it's just every year he redoes it as well. So he adds bits to it, changes it, keeps it up to date. So if you buy the digital copy through LearnPub, I think you get the free update. So definitely check that out. And then for online stuff, there's this thing called Kube Campus by Kasten, which is like Veeam. And it's sort of free Kubernetes courses, hands-on labs, so you don't have to pay for everything. And they give you scenarios, even things like Helm, installing Grafana, Prometheus, and stuff like that. So the whole ecosystem that goes with Kubernetes as well, you get hands-on experience. So definitely check that out.
This might sound a bit cliche, but I would say get certified for sure, because the Kubernetes exams are all practical. There's no multiple choice. You're literally doing things that you would do at work. I can say in both of the exams that I took, this is almost like the universe right here. It's like magic. Both of the exams that I took, the next couple of days after the exam, someone came to me and asked me something that I was able to solve because of what I learned in taking the exam. I did that with the CKA and the CKAD. It was literally like, how is this happening? Like, it was like a day or two later, somebody's like, hey, can you help me with this? I'm like, wow, I know how to do this. I'm studying for the exam. Like I said, yeah, like definitely it's worth it's worth it to get certified for sure.
So I guess just piggybacking on that question, how do you folks keep up with all the greatest and latest technology that's coming out with Kubernetes, right? Is it, as you said, every couple of months there's new updates coming out. So talk about your experience.
I listen to Kaslin. And I'm not joking. Like, the Kubernetes podcast is an amazing resource. It has people from all over the community, not just from Google. And Kaslin, you are an amazing host. You're doing a great job there. So for me, the Kubernetes podcast is the #1 learning resource. I'll add just being on Twitter and seeing people share either in the form of a blog post or in the form of a tweet what they are going through and what they're experimenting with is another great learning resource for me. I've taken a new role in September, and since that new role, I've been less able to get my own hands on, and just being able to see what other people are able to do and able to achieve has been great via either Twitter or LinkedIn. And even if you're achieving something what might seem very basic to you, it might be very advanced for somebody else. So please share it with the community. If it's a tweet, a blog post, a video, there will be people watching and listening.
And I'll
For
add
me,
to that
one of
that's-
the go ahead.
It's very broad. So there's so much going on in Kubernetes all the time. There's so much coming out. It's really hard to keep track of. You can always check out the release blogs and go to events, but there's going to be so much information about so many different use cases. So it's important to try to find the communities that are specifically interested in the types of use cases that you're looking at. Like the Data on Kubernetes community is a community that's specifically focused on stateful workloads. So it's important to kind of narrow things down. Steve.
Yeah, the DOK community, they're great. And they always have great information out there. So I subscribe to newsletters, and that might sound a little old school, but like Nigel has a newsletter, Weaveworks has a newsletter. And the reason I like those newsletters, I don't subscribe to a ton of them. I pick a few select ones, but they will curate like articles, and you can quickly scan those. And if you see something interesting, you can click on it and then dive deeper into it. And if there's like news or updates, they'll usually put those in the newsletters. You can kind of use it as a quick way to get highlights. And then like user groups, I try to attend user groups and watch stuff like this, right, from the community.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's see if you have any questions from the audience. So there's a question saying, would any of those resources work for folks reviewing Kubernetes implementation from a non-dev security perspective?
So one thing that was mentioned was the certification, and that's useful. Glenn, you had a good experience with that. There are a few different certifications. There's the Certified Kubernetes Administrator, which is kind of a general running Kubernetes itself kind of thing. There's the Certified Kubernetes Application Developer, which is about becoming a YAML engineer and writing all of the declarative files that tell Kubernetes how to run things. And then there's the Certified Kubernetes Security. I don't even actually know what that is, but it's CKS. So there's another certification specifically for security concerns. So if you're looking for security resources, you might look for resources focused toward that certification.
I'm not sure why they have it set up like that, but you have to take the CKA to take the CKS.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes a whole lot of sense to me, because you might not want to take the CKA, but yeah, that's how it's set up. Not for the CKAD though. You can just take that one.
I think
thinking.
CoCloud. Sorry, carry on.
No worries, Richard. You can go first.
I was just going to say, I think CoCloud, which Glenn says is good for CK, and that has a CKS course. So if that's what you want to focus on, go and have a look at that.
I'm also thinking like the question may also be because I can see it in the chat. It's like for those who may be reviewing, like typically a security engineer who may come in who does not necessarily work with Kubernetes like in depth and may wonder, okay, where do I start to understand which important security points I need to check? I would also recommend checking out some of the standards out there, like for instance, OWASP Top 10 for containers for Kubernetes, really good. They have even a cheat sheet with concrete examples on what you need to check, like how do you set the security contexts so that you get that impression of what needs to be checked and even where you would need to check that, and then you could go more in depth with your platform engineers to like show you and guide you, especially if you don't have much experience with it from before. And there are many other standards out there as well, like CIS Kubernetes benchmark as well. I think, so I think it's worth checking those out because they could really help if you're coming from the security field, and it can be hard suddenly switching to the container and Kubernetes world.
Also, another resource that I just remembered and I want to throw out there, especially because Christina, you might be interested in this. At KubeCon North America 2019, Tabitha Sable and Brad Giesemann and a few other folks, Peter Benjamin and Jimmy Mesta. I apologize. But a few of the folks really involved with security and Kubernetes put together a Capture the Flag for KubeCon NA 2019. And that is available still today on securekubernetes.com. And so you can run it yourself. I actually did that on a live stream once, and it was a really wonderful experience. I learned a lot from it. So try a Capture the Flag from securekubernetes.com.
And while you are on it, Kathleen, another great resource there is Kubernetes Goat, and this is just awesome. I love using it in like workshops on the security because it's intentionally vulnerable cluster. So you deploy these resources, and then you could use those scenarios where you could see the concepts like namespaces do not provide tenant isolation by default, and you could use all those vulnerable use cases to show what will happen if you don't configure it properly. So this you could also deploy on a bunch of different Kubernetes distributions. So if you want to keep up this more gamified way of exploring the security aspect of Kubernetes, you could use that as well.
So I guess a follow-up question on that would be, do we see the benefits of guardrail in Kubernetes cluster then?
I'd say absolutely. I think putting guardrails around your cluster is super important because so many things can go wrong and there are so many things to take into account. Like as you just think, I've saw an example once of what a deployment file, and for those of you who don't know Kubernetes at all right now, a deployment is basically just the definition of your application. And I think you can have a deployment file with as little as 20-ish lines of YAML, but the Kubernetes is not secure by default. And so if you were to deploy just the sample deployment.yaml that you'll find in every training course, that will not be a secure environment, and you'll need to add like an additional 30 or 40 lines to make your deployment secure and make sure that there's no privilege escalations and you run it as a non-root user and all of those types of deals. So putting guardrails in place, and I know on Azure we have Azure Policy that can do that. I am sure that Google has an equivalent where you can either change the object as it's getting written to enforce what you want to enforce, or you just deny anything that's not compliant. I think that is critical for success because otherwise, I think engineers are, I mean this in the most positive sense possible, but engineers are lazy by default. And if you don't put the guardrails in place, you open up a lot of vulnerabilities.
And to kind of piggyback off that, I think having those guardrails is very, very, very beneficial. And at KubeCon, one of the big buzzwords was like build a platform to where your developers might not even have to touch Kubernetes. They might not have might not even need to log into Kubernetes if you can build a platform for them to go to say, okay, this is what you can do. You define your application, you put all of your configuration in a Git repo, have pull requests set up to where people are reviewing your code and everything like that, following the GitOps workflow to where, they don't even need to log into Kubernetes. And I totally agree with it. Like I said, KubeCon, that's all they were talking about, like platform, build a platform. So that way, you know what's going into the cluster at all times.
And is that how you have it set up right now, Glenn?
Yep. We're working toward building that platform. Actually, we're really we kind of have it built to where we have an interface where our developers can select what they need, click a button, and the deployments are automatically going to Kubernetes. Where and you can do that if you're going to provide them with the tools to where they don't need to log into the cluster. So if you have Splunk or some logging system, they can go there and they don't need to log into the cluster and get the logs. If you have some monitoring system, they can go there and look at their service to service transaction times or their metrics for their application. They don't need to go into Kubernetes. So it's almost like if you want access to Kubernetes, just tell me why. Because if you got a legitimate reason, no problem. But part of being production ready is you have all the tools that you need at your disposal to troubleshoot your application, to deploy your application, to monitor your application.
Yeah, I tried to build all of my customers' AKS clusters where no one logs in, only the pipeline or the GitOps will actually touch the cluster. Nothing else touches it. We have a break glass user, which is maybe hidden away under privileged identity management, conditional access, and all that stuff. Nothing touches that cluster at all, apart from the pipeline or the GitOps, and that's it.
What is GitOps?
I can take that one unless somebody else wants to. Or
go ahead. Have at
it. So for me, I look at GitOps as a workflow where all of your code is stored in a repository. And the only way to deploy that code is, having what's called a pull request, to where you have something that you want to deploy, you create a pull request, you have other people review it, and they have to actually approve it before it gets merged into your master branch. And you can also automate and build off that and say, okay, if somebody approves this pull request, it'll automatically get deployed. So you're really just automating the full pipeline. But it's basically from the repo to the cluster, but in between you have these approvals set up.
And does that come?
I'm just going to add one thing to that one. So with the GitOps, it pulls it into the cluster rather than pipelines where it pushes it into the cluster. So it just gives you a better security sort of bubble.
Does that come out of the box with Kubernetes, that GitOps model?
Nope. There's a lot of tools for it, like Argo CD. If you look at Steve's shirt, that's the logo for Argo. But Flux V2, Argo and Flux are a lot of the popular ones out there. Maverick is pretty dope too. But yeah, there are some. If you go to the CNCF landscape, you can see all of their projects. They've got over 100 projects, some incubating, some graduated. And it's categorized too. To say if you want to look for CI/CD tools, if you want to look for security tools, click on this one. Almost any project or any feature that you need or functionality that you need, it'll be part of the CNCF landscape.
All right. So
Shout out to Kessler.
Oh, nice.
CNCF.
Shout out to the CNCF folks. Yeah.
Love it. All right. So I have a question about it. There's a lot of talk about security, right? So each one of you, if you could give me one or two top security recommendations that we should really be considering on Kubernetes.
I'll say use GitOps. Don't let people log into your clusters. Don't let developers and folks that aren't Kubernetes administrators log into your clusters.
Number one for me is update your clusters. Kubernetes deprecates versions, like Kubernetes has like an N-2 support policy. So right now we're on 1.26. That means that 26, 25, and 24 are supported, but anything prior to that is out of support. So if there are any security issues in those versions, they will not get patched. So number one recommendation is have an update process in place. And I think number two is have some form of policy enabled. Either if that is a cloud provider's policy using Azure policy or the Google or Amazon equivalent, or something bespoke like an OPA plus gatekeeper. But those two, updating and having policies in place, are my number two recommendations.
I totally agree with that. And to even kind of go off of that, you know, like again at KubeCon, there was so many security vendors, and it'll have you thinking like, okay, like I said, I look at Kubernetes as an operating system. So after you get your policies and, you know, of your RBAC and stuff locked down, now we have to think about viruses and malicious software getting on your nodes and things like that. So there are a lot of security vendors that will actually scan your images, scan the repository. They actually will run in the cluster and search for anomalies that could pose a security risk. Because Kubernetes is new. Like I think someone mentioned it earlier, nobody's a Kubernetes expert. It's just so much to learn and it's still new. So, but I think we'll have those same vulnerabilities as we have with like the server OS, to where you'll need to eventually purchase or use open source software or purchase a tool that can, perform security checks and, remove malicious software if that ever happens.
And just to add on to that, we're talking about update in Kubernetes, but you've also got to update all the applications you install into it. So your ingress controllers, that security software, all of that also needs to be managed as well.
Yep.
I think one of this. Sorry, Kat. You want to go first?
Go ahead. No.
Oh. Okay. One of the priorities on my top list is also don't expose your Kubernetes API server, because if you have seen some of the reports where we have up to 1 million clusters exposed globally, you probably wouldn't be in that list or wouldn't want to be in that list, hopefully. And at least for managed Kubernetes services, there are many opportunities out of the box. Just starting with basic IP ranges would be a great first step. And like if with AKS, a good example there is that by default it's actually it's available on the public internet. You just are not able to authenticate to it, but you need to be aware of that unless you provide the IP ranges, it's open, so the scanners can hit it and know that this is a valid URL. So that is also something to know about. But such tools like Glenn mentioned would really help you to get this information in like a great list, and even try to provide some suggestions on how to fix that.
Everything everybody else has said drives home my number one Kubernetes security tip, which is stop assuming that Kubernetes is secure by default. It extremely isn't. It does have a lot of like out of the box security features built into it, but they are not enabled by default. So you cannot just roll with it, even if it's a managed service. You really cannot just roll with it. People think there is some kind of security and complexity, and to an extent, I guess that's true. But Kubernetes is extremely popular now. There are a lot of very expensive workloads running on it. And that complexity is not as much of a barrier to potential attackers as it used to be. So beyond that, I would say enable and use RBAC, because one of the more common issues with Kubernetes early on for people is things having excess privileges that they really don't need, and people having excess privileges that they really don't need. Also enabling and using TLS, transport layer security, absolutely everywhere you can is also super duper important.
And one misconception that I've run across a lot too is people thinking that namespaces are secure. Putting things in different namespaces makes it a bit more secure, but it's not a best practice for security because there are so many components and resources in Kubernetes that are not namespace. And like by default, pods can talk to each other in the cluster. So namespaces are not a security tool. It's logical
They're an
separations that give
organizational
people
tool.
access. Exactly.
And Kat and I are on the same page. I was going to say, familiarize yourself with how far Kubernetes gets you.
Mhm.
It's not a security tool on its own. It's
Yep.
a distributed computing and scaling tool. So
Yep.
you're going to need tools outside of Kubernetes. Familiarize yourself with Kubernetes role-based access controls, or RBAC, and also with things like OPA Gatekeeper and some of the other tools that folks here have mentioned.
Awesome. Great answers. I love it. I love it. One of the things I want to circle back. I know we talked about, and maybe we kind of glazed over it, but we said security tools. But you each just touch on one of your favorite security tools that you're using to manage production workloads, Kubernetes.
So again, at KubeCon, there were it was like 70% security vendors. One of the ones that was very interesting to me and our DevOps team was SysDig. Not to go into the specifics of it because we're not actually using it, but it seems to be one of the popular ones. But one of the ones I've actually used is there's a product that SUSE just purchased called New Vector. It's a pretty good tool for security. It'll it can set up it can do things like stop people from execing in the pods and stop the communication from pod to pod, scanning your image repositories and things like that. So that would be one that I could just throw out there, or two.
So for me, it will be Azure Defender for containers, or Microsoft Defender for containers, as it's now called, in AKS. And if you're using Microsoft Azure Arc, then you can use it for GKE, Google, AWS. But if we're talking about the CNCF ones, I would probably go with ArmoSec, which have just sort of donated their product to the CNCF. It's got a nice RBAC visualizer inside it as well, so you can actually get your RBAC right using nice visual guides.
And I don't have a particular commercial solution, but the one thing that I think most people should enable is a form of network policy on Kubernetes. By default, all traffic within a Kubernetes cluster is allowed to flow, so every pod can communicate with every other pod, whether or not they are in different namespaces. Like the network is just flat. With network policy, you can be very deterministic in which pod can communicate with which other pod. And so installing a form of network policy is what I would recommend. Most of these solutions are open source and have some commercial backing. Like if you think about a Calico supported by Tigera, there's Cilium that's supported by Isovalent, but network policy is one of the things that I would enable.
Would you go as far as recommending a service mesh?
It's it's a very good question.
I had to throw that out there.
I would not recommend the service mesh from the get-go. I think it adds some additional complexity to your deployment, and if you haven't quantified the positive impact of the service mesh, the negative impact into the additional overhead, both from a configuration perspective as well as from a management perspective, as well as from just a resource overhead perspective, I would say I wouldn't recommend the service mesh to everyone. But as you have really large-scale microservice-based applications, I think a service mesh can add a ton of value to your deployments, but I wouldn't start there from the get-go. I would start with network policy from the get-go, and then add in a service mesh as need be.
Wait, time out. So what's service mesh? I'm not sure I even understand.
Oh, no.
Good question. Yeah, what is a service mesh? I think of a service mesh as an additional layer 7 network layer that you add on top of your applications that provides you more visibility in the network traffic that is happening between your applications, as well as more control into your network routing. Like you could very clearly route, I want requests to that URL to go to that pod and requests to another URL to go to that pod. versioning is way easier with a not easier. You can do more advanced versioning with a service mesh. It can do mutual TLS, so it can encrypt all your traffic, and it gives you the additional visibility. Popular service meshes are, I think, the most popular is Istio, maybe tied with Linkerd. I think those are the two popular ones. There's other ones out there as well, but it's like an additional network layer that adds a ton of value, but also adds a ton of complexity.
Yep. And to kind of piggyback off that, I would say double down on if you're only use service mesh if you're using actual microservices, because it performs functions like service discovery. If you need to know what services are talking to each other, and different features, even has like circuit breaking features to where if a service can't talk to another service, how many times should I try before I don't talk to that service again or consider that service unavailable? And getting like ingress into your clusters, like Neil said, being able to send traffic from outside of the cluster to certain back-end services through like the gateways and virtual services that Istio or a service mesh would allow, or that gives you access to.
I would like to add that if you are going to try to use a service mesh for the first time and you're kind of not sure what they are and you're learning your way through it, Linkerd has truly outstanding documentation and a really good quick start guide that explains the reason and what is going on in every single command they ask you to run. It's really top-notch quick start guide, for me at least.
I do back up Kat on that. I think like compared to Istio, for example, I find it quite advanced in terms of configuring and understanding. So it's like a more complex version of service mesh in my opinion. But Linkerd was super easy to start with. And they're really good at documenting how to do that.
And it's a lot more lightweight compared to Istio as well inside the cluster. So you're going to spend less money because you need less compute costs. So it's good.
Mm.
Yep. I think the big justification for service mesh is when your developers come to you and say, hey, my service is slow. Service A was trying to talk to service B. What happened? So if you don't have any service mesh capabilities, you're going to be looking like, yeah, let me run some type of curl command. But with service mesh, it'll actually show you like the latency between services if you have a bunch of services, and you can kind of say, okay, this service got upgraded and now the connection is slow. Let's troubleshoot this actual service. It definitely provides a lot of functionality. It's super complex. I'm still learning Istio right now. But yeah, if the need is not there, don't use it. But if you have microservice applications in production, you'll need some way to for services to discover each other and have ingress into your cluster.
Okay. One question from the audience is, would love to hear from the panel regarding their thoughts on using CNI versus Kubernetes. Do your customer needs routable IP to your pods? Who wants to take it?
It sounds and like, just to explain the difference between KubeNet and a CNI. CNI stands for Container Network Interface, and it's an open standard where you have multiple implementations as to how your container how your containers in your cluster can do networking. KubeNet is not a CNI implementation; it's just a default overlay network in Kubernetes. My recommendation is go with a CNI implementation. They add way more functionality, and I think all cloud providers have their own. I think a very popular option right now also is Cilium, because it adds some additional functionality as well. But go with a CNI. I think KubeNet is good for experimentation, but for production, do a CNI. That's my thoughts.
Also, when you go with the CNI on cloud providers like Azure, right, it's going to do that routing for you between the pods that are running on your Kubernetes cluster and services that are outside, right? So in Azure, you have subnets, and so you'll be able to talk. You'll be able to have traffic talk outside of the cluster without having to basically set up your own routing, configure UDRs, and go through the pain of all of that.
One good thing about Kubernetes, because it is the overlay, if you're very limited on your IP ranges, then it's good for that. But Azure CNI has the overlay feature in preview, so you can use that going forward. But yeah, if you're really tight on your IP ranges, Kubernetes is probably where you want to go.
And that was the number one reason when I was still in the field, like working with companies, that was the number one reason they wanted to go with Kubernetes, was because they were worried they would run out of IPs. And so it's really good that we have that in preview now. So that was like a big issue up front, always.
I am curious to also hear from our co-opetition, Kazan. What do you see at Google and GKE specifically when it comes to like networking and KubeNet versus CNI?
Honestly, I haven't looked into that very much. Networking isn't really my area, so I'm not sure which one would be better, but I was just thinking I need to make a note to look into KubeNet a bit more after this.
And I apologize for putting you on the spot.
No worries. We can learn together.
Don't worry, Kazlan. I also think networking is basically magic.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is.
Area of expertise.
But also like kind of core to it, because essentially Kubernetes is a tool for distributed systems. So what it does is it takes computers and it hooks them together. So that's basically all networking. So basically everything we do is networking, yet it still feels like magic.
It does.
I'll tell you, in my design sessions with customers, networking is either the first or the second topic that comes up, because that's
always.
Yeah.
And it's always the longest. Like they want to talk about that the most. That and security.
Yeah.
Yes. So given we're talking about networking here, as we're just following trends in the industry, does anybody want to comment on eBPF?
I do not know enough about it to have an educated opinion on the subject. However, I will say that it seems to be extremely hot, because there are always 1,000 talks about it at KubeCon. And multiple meetups specifically for it. So it's a thing I have been meaning to get a firmer grasp on. I don't know much about it other than it is wildly popular. That and Wasm, both just hot.
Yeah, Wasm, I continue to see that, and some folks predicting that's going to take over containers.
Yeah.
But you can run it in Kubernetes, so it's all good.
So
a great
and
person
I can run
to
Doom,
learn.
So.
A great person to learn from on eBPF would be Liz Rice. Yes. Liz did a great keynote at Cloud Native Security Con about eBPF and used this wonderful Star Wars analogy. As we've all established, we all love analogies. So definitely check that out. I'll go grab a link to it.
I've got one of her books over on the bookshelf ready to read from KubeCon, and I've just not got around to it yet. But it goes really down low to the kernel level, so you can do a lot of cool things like network troubleshooting. So you don't need the service mesh to troubleshoot the networking. You can do it down at the eBPF level using Inspector Gadget, which we put a link in. So check that out as well.
Okay, so I think we're almost running out of time, and we want to be respectful of everybody's time. So do we have any more questions from the audience?
There's a lot of chat going on. I love it. I love it.
Chris, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I know there's one we always seem to wrap up with like one crazy question. I don't want it to like take up an entire half an hour, but if it does, so be it. But the one thing that I kind of look at is, where do you all think the future of Kubernetes is heading? I know that's probably a terrible question, but like, where do you think it's going to go?
So I think the future of Kubernetes is it's going to continue to be not it, but it's going to continue to be abstracted away from us, right? Glenn mentioned earlier about building platforms so developers don't have to worry about or be bothered with like Kubernetes. We're seeing a lot of multi-cloud Kubernetes buzz. So as a developer, do you really care what cloud your workloads are running in? Things like GitOps. So abstracting Kubernetes away, and also and cloud providers just starting to see more services be built on top of Kubernetes. So it's becoming just a part of the fabric everywhere. Mm-hmm. That's where I think the future.
Yeah, it'll become ubiquitous. Yeah, it'll become ubiquitous. I think it's going to be covered in so many layers of abstraction and so widely adopted that we're not even going to really notice it anymore. And we're going to become the old weird nerds, like 100%. I'm going to turn into my dad.
The mainframe operators, Kubernetes admins will become the mainframe operators.
Yeah, I'm going to become my dad, and that's fine.
Yeah. So Kat, you bring up a really good point. So part of the reason I decided to dive right into managed Kubernetes versus going and deploying everything from scratch was because I wanted to learn Kubernetes and dive into the space, but not be so stuck with the nuts and bolts that I didn't want to get stuck there, right? And I think the important thing is to focus on the workloads, like running the workloads, understanding the process side of things, how we do focus on like what Kubernetes does and why businesses use it and where the value is. And so when Kubernetes just becomes this part of the fabric everywhere, you go work on something else, maybe WASM or something else.
Yeah.
And so because I've been a system engineer my whole life, and I compare the Kubernetes to server OS, I kind of think that it will follow the path that we did with servers. So like back in the day, companies had like 1 or 2 servers. And then you had this thing called like the hypervisor, where it was like, man, we could build servers inside of servers now. So then companies had like hundreds of servers. And then we got to the point where we had configuration management, like with Puppet and Ansible. And now companies have thousands of servers. I can kind of see that same pattern already with Kubernetes, to where, we have a Kubernetes cluster and we dump everything in there. But now you have virtual clusters. So like VMware offers their virtual, their TKGS offering. And it's basically a hypervisor for Kubernetes, where you have a supervisor and management cluster, and you can spin up as many virtual clusters as you want to. So now I think companies will go from, okay, we have two or three clusters, so now we got about 30 or 40 maybe. And then once we get configuration management down packed to where we can centralize our management for Kubernetes and say, hey, I need the Dynatrace on every cluster in my environment. I can do it at the click of a button, or even better, be declarative and say, okay, our clusters are reading from this manifest and they configure themselves. I think we'll start to, because we're human and we always want more, I think we'll run more clusters. You'll have companies, the average amount of clusters for a company will be like, yeah, we got about 500 Kubernetes clusters. There's an article that was written by Mercedes-Benz, and they said they had like 900 clusters. So
wasn't it Lyft or somebody that was like 5,000 microservices or some absurd number like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, in my opinion, I think it'll follow kind of like that pattern once a lot of the configuration is abstracted away, and we have offerings that say, okay, at the click of a button, you can spin up a cluster. It's production grade. And, like with Puppet, every 30 minutes, it prevents configuration drift by looking at the like the file that configures it and make sure it has the configuration that you want. I think once we have that with Kubernetes to where it's like, yo, every 10 minutes, this cluster is going to check in and make sure it has every configuration that we declared it to have. I think we'll be able to have more clusters. That's just my opinion. I don't know. It may never happen, but I think it will.
I think tools are already being built for that. So I think you're right.
Yep.
We are headed in that direction. And I know fleet management is a topic that's increasing, and GitOps can handle that configuration management, but you need that fleet part to really fit the pieces together. But
which is in preview in Azure right now.
Thanks for the plug.
Somewhat piggybacking of Glenn and the idea that there will be a lot of clusters, I also think that Kubernetes will evolve into a version that will have a long-term supported version. Because right now, I mentioned it earlier, but you have to upgrade like once every 3 versions. And I think that's not sustainable for a lot of companies. Like I think Chick-fil-A has a Kubernetes cluster in every store. You mentioned Mercedes-Benz, and having to go in and update those once a year or multiple times a year, I think won't be sustainable. So I think in the middle term future, I actually hope, it's not a prediction, but I hope there will be a long-term support version, because that will be very helpful for those customers that aren't on the bleeding edge. And as I think about where we are with this modernization into cloud and into Kubernetes, there is a very big long tail of customers that haven't modernized certain applications in years. And I think the industry is moving towards a Kubernetes model, but if an application that hasn't been touched in 15 years now needs to be updated every year, that's going to create so much overhead for companies. So a long-term support version is going to be critical, in my opinion.
I feel it actually, because I am in that situation where we have customers in exactly this situation. We're also using .NET, so even the LTS version of .NET that is every 3 years is a total disaster for some of the customers, because that's just the way it is. The way they have security, especially customers with high security requirements, they have a special set of routines they need to go through before they accept a new version. And I also do hope that the same would be an opportunity in terms of Kubernetes, because one thing when you control your for example, AKS clusters, and your customers are not necessarily dependent on that. But if you have customers that have these requirements that you need to deliver for, that cannot upgrade that often, that would make their life a bit easier, and our life that need to battle with those customers to kind of make it easier for them to introduce a new version. So I also do hope it will come.
Awesome. All right. Fantastic. My head is starting to hurt. I mean, you all been fantastic. Thank you for this information. I know there's been a lot of feedback. Everybody's saying thank you. But seriously, this has been awesome. Thank you all for your insights, for your experience, for joining us tonight. Abdul, thank you for kind of leading at the beginning too. It's just been fantastic having you all here. We'd love to have you back sometime. Actually, we're getting poked. A couple people want to know deeper dives on networking and service mesh, and I think you lit some fires. So we appreciate that, and love hearing back from the community already of maybe another session at some time. So we'd love to have you. Again, thank you all. We appreciate it. Abdul, any parting thoughts?
No, thank you, everybody. I know it's late for people who are in Europe, so thanks for coming on. And amazing. I learned quite a bit, honestly. So a lot of terms, like I'm gonna go and look them up, because I have no idea at this point. But yeah, this was a great session, and thank you so much for taking out time from your busy schedule and coming on the show. With that being said, have a good night, good evening, everybody, and see you soon.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.